All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Kegabine. I'm the Adult Event Coordinator here at the Garland County Library. And tonight I'm here with the author, Michael Ray Taylor, who wrote the brand new release, Hidden Nature, Southern Wild Caves. Now, as his website describes it, his book is about the vast underground wilderness that underlies the American South. Now, Mr. Taylor has written several books and worked on several documentaries on the topic of caving. And it covers everything from safety to importance, their importance to our ecosystems. And his day job is a journalism professor, is that correct? Who chairs the Communication and Theater Arts Department at Henderson State University. So thank you for joining us this evening, Mr. Taylor. How are you doing?
I'm fine, Paul. Thank you for having me. Thanks to the Garland County Library. And I also want to thank Wordsworth Books, which is the bookstore, working with this event for selling the book tonight. If you don't win one of the free ones, be sure to pick up a copy from them. Excuse me. I've been in Zoom meetings all day because I'm 35 miles away at Henderson, where we are having a fall semester start Monday, and we're getting as ready for it as we can in these times. But I realized in these meetings this morning, I'm starting my 30th year at Henderson, which I can't believe. I'm not from Arkansas originally. I grew up in Florida, and I started caving right about 40 years ago with the Florida State Cave Club. I was a college undergraduate then, and ever since then, people have been saying, "Why do you do it? Why do you crawl down in the mud?" And this book, I think, is as one of my fellow cavers said, you did a good job of explaining the why. And so that's what I want to talk about this evening as we get going here.
I'm glad to have you here this evening, and I'm going to let you take over, and you've got a lot to talk about here in just a minute. But first, let me do a couple housekeeping things for our audience. We're going, like you just mentioned, we're going to have a few copies of Southern Wild Caves available for checkout here at the library.
By the way,
I'm sorry.
Wild Southern.
Wild Southern Cave. Yeah, right
Southern,
there.
I like Southern Wild, but the publisher went with Wild Southern.
Wild Southern Cave. We're going to have a few copies here at the library to check out. And like you mentioned, we're going to have some available as prizes, signed copies, for anyone who leaves a comment or asks a question in our live feed tonight. So thank you for providing those copies, by the way. So I'm going to let you go ahead and take over, and I'll be back with you here shortly, and I'll ask the audience questions. So without further ado, Mr. Michael Ray Taylor.
Thanks again, Paul. And by the way, I can't see the chat on this particular version of Live Talk. So, but please ask those questions, and we're going to have plenty of time at the end to answer. And Paul will keep track of them, and you get a shot at a free book by doing that. As I said, I started caving in Florida. I grew up in Florida in the Daytona Beach area. And, I was a short block from the beach. It was a very pretty place, but it didn't have much in the way of hills or interesting geology. And so when my family would take vacations in the car when I was little, mountains were amazing to me. And we would go visit relatives in Illinois and Missouri, and we would see these signs everywhere on the highway and painted on bards, see Ruby Falls, see the Mystery Cave, see Rock City, see the Lost Sea. And to me, they sounded like, magical places. And when I was 6 years old, my parents, after me reading these signs annoyingly for hundreds of miles, they finally took us to Ruby Falls. And it was magical is the only word for it. And so I sort of fell in love with caves at that moment. But it wasn't until I went to college and discovered I didn't even know there were dry caves in Florida. I knew there were springs with underwater caves that were very dangerous. Divers got in real trouble in those all the time. But there's hundreds of dry caves that are a short drive from Florida State near Tallahassee, and there's more in Georgia. And with this group, I began exploring very quickly, and soon was going with them over Thanksgiving breaks and part of Christmas holiday up to the area they call TAG, which stands for the border of Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. And if you draw a 100-mile circle around that spot, it's incredibly dense with caves, and many of them are what we call vertical caves, meaning it's a hole in the ground and it's a deep pit. You rappel into it. If there's any cave passage at the bottom, you explore it. But sometimes the pits themselves are so beautiful that that's what we did. We just went down the pit and back up. Sometimes 300 or 400 feet, and everyone thought I was crazy then, but I kept on doing that. And eventually, after I left college and got married, I wound up going to grad school in South Carolina, where I still could travel to the caves occasionally from there. And I started writing and wound up spending several years as a freelance writer. And of course, writing for magazines, you have to write whatever the magazine wants you to write about, or you come up with ideas. But because of my connection to this fairly secretive caving world, I knew about really great cave systems that were just then being explored. And so I started getting paid to go caving and write stories about it, which was a dream come true. And it was during this time that I realized there was this golden age of cave discovery taking place. Back in the 1960s, cavers had developed the single rope technique that lets you go down into caves and safely out in a fairly efficient manner. And there were also new techniques in figuring out where to find caves using a combination of the flow of groundwater and photographic images and topographic maps. And all of this continued to evolve during the time I was caving. So luckily, I'm still in this golden age of cave discovery, and there are magnificent new cave systems that have just been mapped in the last 15, 20 years. My first book, Cave Passages, grew out of some of those articles I wrote in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And it was a partial memoir of my caving to that point. But it was also really focused on some of those specific discoveries and some of the people behind those discoveries. Whereas as I get older and older and older, and I still do this, I realize that the people I started caving with back when I was, 19 and 20 years old, many of them are still at it. And it is the culture of caving is almost as interesting as the caves themselves. And certainly the friendship and the camaraderie of going into, a lot of people go into the wilderness, which is great. And, a lot of cavers also like to go hiking or kayaking or many other nature pursuits. But there's something about caving. I think the fact that most people think it's so weird and so crazy, and you can't really describe it until you've done it, that makes this culture unique. So when I decided to write, I very quickly wrote 3 books about caves in the mid 90s, late 90s, and the last one was 2001. But 20 years later, I realized that what has happened since I wrote those books is there's been new discoveries that I really want to write about in the present, but I've gained a new understanding of what caving has meant in my own life. And I wanted to reflect back on that a little. So I decided to create a book that would alternate between the story of those college years and exploring those caves for the first time and learning how to do it, and watching some of the at the time I started caving, there'd been 20 years of really hardcore caving before me, but there's been another 20 years since then. And it's been amazing to see some of these discoveries, but because it's a kind of a secretive thing, they're really not that well known in the public. And so I've had the pleasure of writing about them, but now they're branching off in so many different ways. One example is connected to hot springs, actually. You may remember back in 1996 when NASA made the announcement that was immediately contested everywhere about finding a meteorite in Antarctica, which came from Mars. And that part wasn't contested. Everyone knew chemically it could not have come from any place but Mars. But the question was whether it had once had ancient microbes within it, and they left their fossils in some deposits within that meteorite. And back then I was doing a lot of writing about space science as well as caving, because caving has sort of led me to that. And this guy, Carl Allen, who was a planetary scientist at the Johnson Space Center, I heard him give a talk one day, and he said, if I could just find a place where hot springs emerge from deep underground with no sunlight, so there's no photosynthesis, and could look at some of those organisms, maybe I could find some fossils that resemble what we see in this Mars meteorite. But he said, so we're looking, we haven't found a place so far. So at the end, I raised my hand and I said, I know a place. And so that's how I wound up taking some NASA scientists beneath Central Avenue in Hot Springs. And we did about a 1.5 year long project. We got permission from the National Park Service with some of the springs that emerge in the tunnel under Central Avenue, and also several of the springs that are in the basements of the bathhouses. And this was at a time when they had not yet begun to restore the bathhouses. Many of them were closed and in disrepair and a little bit dangerous to walk around in. But I had permission from the superintendent to go into their display springs and place slides, which after a couple of months would be covered with calcite deposits. And I took those down to Houston and they scanned them in the microscope. And sure enough, it looked very much like the things in that Martian meteorite, which was amazing to me. And so I've done a lot of writing following the scientists who are studying what appears to be this vast ecosystem that's deep underground, and caves provide a window into it. Now, we know caves have all kinds of interesting life. Bats, certainly. Bats most famously, and unfortunately for the bats, that they usually get a negative rap for what they do in the caves. But and then there's other things like insects and salamanders and blind fish. And Arkansas has a wealth of these things. Arkansas cave life is truly amazing. But the microbial life is something that I started writing about, about 20 years ago in a serious way, and getting some of the microbiologists would let me go on trips with them, because this is life that exists without sunlight, without traditional nutrients. The base of the microbial food chain is often just particular minerals, and they're taking, just raw chemicals, sometimes methane, sometimes manganese, and they're turning them into food sources. And then other microbes and fungi and all sorts of things will live off of these. And so I've been attuned to that. And there were several things that happened when I first started writing this book about 3 years ago. And one of them was I saw a photo on Facebook that I knew from past expeditions in caves out west looked like unusual microbes had to be making this oddly looking formation I had seen. And so I contacted the caver, and it turned out this was in a cave in Tennessee that only at most a dozen people had been in at that point, mapping this cave system. Most caves are on private land, and landowners get very nervous if they own a big cave system because they're afraid someone's going to get hurt and sue them. So the landowner only let them cave there if they agreed to keep the location a secret and not publish it. But eventually I got permission, so long as we gave it a code name, which is called Secret Squirrel Cave in the book, which is the code name the cavers were using as they mapped it. And working with a biologist from right here at Henderson State University, Dr. James Ingman, and some of his students, we collected some samples. There's a pool in this cave where, if you've ever been to Yellowstone and seen some of the springs that have multicolored rings around the spring, yellow and orange and black, and it's associated with the hot springs out west. Those rings are all different types of microbes. And in this cave, there's bubbles coming up that release a petroleum smell, and there's little black oil globules on the surface of this one pool. We called them tar balls. So there's some native petroleum that's seeping up. This is 100 miles from the parts of Tennessee where you normally have oil wells. But, not large amounts of oil. I don't think anyone's ever going to be able to make money sinking an oil well there, but enough to support this weird microbial ecosystem. And so anyway, I collected some of these samples and took them back here to Arkansas, and Dr. Ingman's students prepared them for DNA analysis. And some of those organisms had only been found in one previous place, which is they call them the black smokers, the deep ocean trenches in the deepest parts of the ocean. And we have these organisms in the middle of Tennessee that are genetic matches, are very close genetic relatives to these things from the deep ocean, and they've never been found anywhere else. So, that raises the question, how do they get to Tennessee? And that's one of the scientific questions I try to explore in the book. But anyway, getting back to telling my own story of caving, I'm not alone in becoming kind of an armchair scientist. Now, there are plenty of actual scientists with PhDs who study things like geology and biology and archaeology and history and many other things you can learn from caves. But I'm unusual in that I like to write about it. So by learning enough to work with the actual scientist, or sometimes learning enough to work beside the actual archaeologist or hold a flashlight for them or do anything to get on their trip, I've been able to see these amazing places. So the book is partly my description of those trips to places to look at the unusual biology, the archaeology, the history, and also that alternates with just stories of why do you do it, how do you do it, and how did I get involved with it. Although most of the book is set, as I say, in Tennessee and Kentucky and Georgia and Florida, there are great caves in Arkansas. And one part of the book has led me to do a new cave project in Arkansas that I launched, unfortunately, just before we all went into lockdown. So it's on pause right now. But I write in the book about white nose syndrome, which is a fungal disease that is devastating bat populations throughout the East. It started in New York State. It may have come to the US from Europe. It may have come from China. No one's exactly sure. In 2006, and it's slowly been moving through bat populations down the Appalachians, and now it's spreading out west. And not all bats are susceptible to it, but those who are, it can kill up to 95% of the bat colonies. So there's all sorts of scientists working on trying to understand how it spreads and trying to figure ways to save our bats, basically. So I've been sort of writing about that and reading about that, and in the process, I've gotten to know through several scientific endeavors another biologist in Arkansas, Dave Thomas, who teaches at Lyon University. And just before we went into lockdown, I took a group of high school students and their biology teacher with Dr. Thomas to a cave in northern Arkansas, where this was back in February, which is when you count the hibernating bats and see how they're coming back from the effects of the white nose syndrome. And we're making a film about this, which we hope is going to be shown eventually as an episode of Arkansas Wildlife, the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission's TV show, and they put some funding into this project. But it's no longer safe to get in a bus with high school students and drive up to the Ozarks for a long day of looking at bats. So we're waiting on that for later. But I do write a lot about some of the scientists who are at the forefront of fighting white nose syndrome. And really, since the book, I finished the book right around Christmas. And so we were just in kind of doing the index and final proofing when the pandemic hit the US. And one of the things that I've found since then, talking to some of the people who are in the book, is that they see what they've learned about how this devastating disease spread through bat populations may teach us some things yet about how disease spreads through human populations. Bats have been helping humans a long time. They're natural pest control. The U.S., I think it was the Department of Commerce, estimated that they do about $3 billion a year of protecting crops from insect devastation. They also pollinate a lot of plants, and generally they get a bum rap when they're very useful. But even studying something like a bat disease, I think this illustrates how there's much in caves that if we learn about them will help us on the surface. Studying the bats also have helped some of these scientists understand how COVID-19 may have first jumped out of bats in Wuhan, China, are actually well south of Wuhan. They wound up in Wuhan and probably went through some intermediary animal along the way. But this research that had been done at the start made it easier for those who are studying the disease to understand its vectors and understand how bat diseases behave in general. Bats are very resistant against viruses, unusually so. But white nose syndrome is a fungal disease, and it turns out they are not very resistant against the fungal disease. Anyway, I can go on and on about this stuff, as any of the students who have gone on caving trips with me will tell you. But I do want to get to your questions pretty soon. So if you haven't done so yet, please type any questions that you have in the chat bar, make a comment. And at the end is when Paul will give away some signed books to some of our questioners and commentators. Let's see, there was one other thing I wanted to talk about, which was really special for me in the cave. And that is, there's a chapter called graffiti. Now, a lot of caves you go to, if they're well known in the South and in Arkansas, around the entrances, people will have spray painted their names, carved their initials. We see this, you know, if you just go hiking along the Buffalo River, you'll see it in rock faces. It's really defacing the nature that is there. And that's something, you know, from my very first college caving trip, they said, you know, leave nothing but footprints, kill nothing but time, take nothing but pictures. And so I was taught not to do this sort of thing. But there's one place where it's really interesting, and that's where the graffiti was put into the cave hundreds, or in some cases thousands of years ago. And so I spent some time in Kentucky and Tennessee while working on this book, looking at historic graffiti left in the Civil War. There's a caver who's, in terms of the number of caves he's visited, is the most experienced in the US, because he keeps meticulous journals and they record he's been in well over 8,000 caves in his lifetime. He's 77 and he still goes caving, you know, a couple of times a week at least. But he and a historian named Joe Douglas have been doing this long-term study on Mammoth Cave National Park. And Mammoth Cave was sort of contested ground during the Civil War. It was originally held by the South and then held by the Union, and it had no military value, but it was considered one of America's greatest natural wonders at the time. And so there was some pride in taking ownership of it in the midst of the Civil War. And the soldiers themselves, when on leave, were able to go and visit the cave. And they left lots and lots of graffiti all over the older historic passages. But interestingly, these two guys have been able to go in and catalog that graffiti and look up the soldiers and tell, you know, their stories up to the war, whether they survived the war, what they did after the war. But more interestingly, go find surviving letters and journals where they describe their visit to the cave and how it provided that escape from the horrors of battle, you know, during a moment of leave, to just appreciate some of the wonders of nature. And that was really cool. But also in Mammoth Cave, and certainly more so in other caves to the south of there, are markings left by ancient Native Americans, some of which go back over 6,000 years. And there's several experts who have, just in the last 15 years, come up with new methods of teasing these pictographs and pictograms, they call them, sometimes etched into the wall, sometimes painted onto the wall, sometimes formed with mud sculptures or other types of artwork that had been overlooked for decades and decades. And really, often they show up in photographs when you can't see them in person. And so I started going to some of those caves, and one special place I was taken to, I've got this shelf with old carbide lamps over here. Those are what we used to use to explore caves. Now there are nice LED lights. I was no further away than I am from that shelf of carbide lamps, and I was following a very narrowly marked trail in a space about no more than 3 feet tall. But we had to stay on this trail, which was marked only with bits of flagging, because right beside us were footprints where 3 people, it looked to be a man, a woman, and a youth or teenager, had walked past, and their bare feet in the soft mud had left, you know, really clear impressions. You could tell these were very heavily calloused feet that ran around outdoors all the time. And they used cane torches and the ash from those torches fell around as they were going into the cave. And so it was fairly easy for scientists to collect some of that ash, and date it at 4,500 years ago. And those three had left their prints there. And I was leaving footprints too. Everyone who goes in the prints leaves caves. And so it was very important for us to not stray off the trail. And it's also very important for the protection of those prints that the cave itself is kept somewhat secret, and there's no more than 2 or 3 trips a year that go into it. And I was very lucky, after some waiting and some help, to be able to go on a trip that was mapping some new passage in that cave. But when you see something like that in person, or when you see a delicate formation that's 15 feet long and less than 1/4 of an inch in diameter, and if you breathe on it, it will fall, it makes you a conservationist. So ultimately, I think the book is largely about reporting what's there, but also conserving it and trying to convince people who never want to go into a place like that why it's worth conserving, and why this culture of cavers that I found myself in 40 years ago is, there's scientists, there's people who never graduated high school, there's all genders, races, all sorts of variety among the cavers. But one thing they all share in common is that love of adventure and discovery, and that concern to protect the caves. And I think that's a good place for me to just throw it open for some questions, if we have any in the chat bar at this point.
Well, thank you for that. And we do have quite a few questions. Can you hear me okay, sir?
Yeah, I can hear you great.
Excellent. All right, so we're going to move on to the Q&A/interview portion of the book talk. And here's a reminder: if you ask any questions in the feed at the end of the presentation, I'm going to randomly select 3 people to win a free signed copy of his brand new release here. So,
reminder from me: if you don't win, buy it from Wordsworth Books, and if you don't buy it from them, buy it from an independent bookstore. Independent bookstores have had a hard time the last few years, and the pandemic has done nothing to help them out. So I want to do everything I can while I've got a new book out to push those indie stores.
Very thoughtful of you. So while we're waiting on the audience to ask a few more, I'm going to start with a few questions on the author side of the book, since this is your 4th book on caving. And I want to ask, how has your experience as an author and a cave researcher changed over the last 25-ish years from book to book? Well,
it's changed in a couple of ways. I mean, I'm obviously older now. You got this going on right here. And the caves have not changed. Some of the methods of exploring them have certainly changed, some of the rope techniques, some of the lights, etc. But I'm more reflective, I guess, as I get older, and more prone to not say, let's see what's around the next bend, but let's pause and look at what's here. And it's not just because I'm struggling to keep up with the young cavers around the next bend. It's because I'm really focusing and observing. And, I've been teaching writing the whole time I've been doing the writing. I did not know I wanted to be a writer. I didn't think I wanted to be a writer back when I started caving in college. And that came to me over the next few years. But since I've become a teacher, one of the things I insist on with students is find those things that you really love and write about them, and your story will always be more interesting. And so that process is a matter of finding, not only caves with an interesting story, but interesting characters who are involved with those caves. And so the book is as much about people as it is about places. But then what you do is you go someplace where this could be fiction. It's not, it really happened, but you steal all the techniques from novelists. You use dialogue, you use action, you use description, and you try to make it read as if you've made it up and it's actually real. And so because I teach this, it kind of keeps me honest to practice it now and then, and to practice it with those things that, like I say, I just truly enjoy. So I think that's now like all authors, I'm going to go look at some of my early books and say, this kid had something going on. But I think this is definitely a more mature book than some of those early ones, in that, the caves aren't going to change that much for me. They didn't change that much for the people who were in them 4,500 years ago. But humans change all the time. And so you can't help reflect on your short time in this earth. And while doing that and literally being in the earth, I get to commit a little bit of philosophy here and there. Yeah.
Thank you. So you're also, of course, a professor at Henderson, and I'm sure being an educator during this pandemic is stressful with school about to resume.
Yeah, school is about to resume, and I don't know anyone who's not nervous about it. I've been in Zoom meetings all day, so if I flub my lines, that's why. I'm just about zoomed out. But we're doing everything we possibly can. A lot of classes are online, and those that are live, most of them, only part of the class meets live one day and part of the class another day. And we've come up with plans to keep, I've seen those horrible pictures of Georgia, of the high school that's all crowded. Mm-hmm. We've got pathways where we're hopefully not going to have students that are any closer than 6 feet apart from each other, going to the room, coming out of the room, and they'll all be 6 feet apart in the room, and we all have to wear masks all the time. I'm at school, but when you're in your office with the door closed, it's the only time you're not allowed to wear your mask, and that's where I'm doing this conversation from. It's scary, but we'll do it, and if cases rise, I'm sure we'll go online pretty quickly.
How have you been handling the challenge of launching a book while preparing to resume teaching?
One nice thing is I know a lot of writers, and they're going through it too, and that made it a little bit easier on me. In fact, the first one of these virtual book talks I ever watched was David Hill talking to you. And I thought, oh man, that was a great talk. Maybe it's possible to do this, to instead of driving all over the country or flying out to the coast and hitting 7 bookstores in 4 days, which I did on a couple of the earlier books. And you never know if you're going to get 50 people or 5 people when you go to those bookstores. At least what I've learned from this process is I talk about the book just as I would at a bookstore. But regardless of how many people can make it to the live event, people are going back afterwards and watching the video. And that's been very gratifying, because I get emails from some of them who see something I did, several days or a week ago, and they have a question, which, by the way, you can find me at the Henderson website, hsu.edu, if any of you have questions after reading the book or before committing to it.
So looks like we have quite a few audience questions waiting.
Let's see what we've got.
Let's see here. All right, let's start with Ralph. He seems to be a fan of yours, since he says you're a great nature writer, and that Cave Passages was an excellent read. And then he asked the question, he says that he had the opportunity 6 months ago to Carlsbad Caverns. He knocked that off his bucket list. And He asked to tell us about your time. Pardon me if I'm pronouncing this wrong.
Lechuguilla.
You're correct. Yep.
Yeah, Lechuguilla in Carlsbad Caverns National Park, which is a national treasure, well known. There is a wild cave that was first entered in 1986 called Lechuguilla Cave, and they recently had a celebration of hitting. I want to get this right. I think at the same time, there were 3 celebrations in national parks for hitting milestones. I think Lechuguilla hit the 200-mile milestone, or no, 150. It was 150 in Lechuguilla. 150 miles of map passage since 1986, and some of it immense, some of it full of the most amazing formations imaginable. There's a place called the Candela Ballroom. The closest thing it looks like to anything I'd ever seen before is in the movies, where when Superman goes to his Fortress of Solitude, that could have been based on the Chandelier Ballroom in Lechuguilla Cave. And some of the unusual formations there are where I first started doing this cave microbiology. There's a microbiologist named Diana Northup who was very active there, and thanks to a bookseller, an independent bookseller named Emily Mobley, who runs a store called Speleo Books, she had been helping Diana on these science trips, and she told me, you got to get on one of these science trips. They're way cool. And so I did, and wound up I probably did about 5 trips to Lechuguilla over the years, and each one is exhausting physically. You often are camping in the cave because you're so far from the entrance. It's going to take you a full day to get back there, and you're either mapping new passages in the area where you camp, or you're doing science in that area. And both are equally exciting because both are about discovery.
Thank you. Gordon has something about the symbolism of the word hidden. He says that caves are hidden in an obvious sense. They're underground and cannot be seen from the surface. And even when you're in a cave, you cannot be sure when you leave that you've seen all of it. But I wonder in what other senses you might mean hidden, and that human exploration might and does with luck reveal.
Well, that is a good, deep question. Deep, I guess, being the operative word. Well, certainly, there is this scientific aspect of hidden, which has to do with these microorganisms deep underground. There's this new thing that's only existed a couple of years, called it's a group on the internet basically, but it's called the Deep Carbon Observatory, and it's had over 100 scientists, I think several hundred at this point, who have joined this group, and they are all investigating life at the extreme depths of the earth. And there's all kinds of life there, and they now think if you took all of the mass on the surface, which is all the fish in the sea, all the humans, all the cows, all the rainforest, and you put them on one side of the scale, this on the other side is probably 10 times more life, maybe 20 times more life than we have on the surface, and yet we know almost nothing about it. That's hidden. The motives of people who do this, not just once or twice, but for a lifetime, those are often hidden. And sometimes you get little hints of them, but only if you've known someone for a very long time. I write a lot about a friend that I met back when I was in college and first beginning to cave, a guy named Lee Pearson, who now lives in Florida, who then lived in Tennessee. And he's probably watching this. Hi, Lee. Good to see you. But, this has been a long friendship for us. It's been about caving, but our whole families have been friends, have gone on joint vacations, and we've grown older. He's 5 years older than me, had health issues, recovered from health issues. And really, there is much of life in that kind of camaraderie of cave exploration. And I try to go for some of that too. I think it's a different attitude than you get among mountain climbers. They tend to be more, as one caver put it one time, a see what I've done type attitude and machismo, whereas cavers are, let's go see what we can do.
Mm-hmm. All right, got a couple questions from Raina. First, she asked, I would like to know the most interesting object or mineral found while you were caving, or what another person's found that astonished you or astounded you.
Well, gosh, there's so many. Object, if I can go man-made object, there's one that I write about in the book, which is a basket that unfortunately fell apart when someone took it in the cave. And the basket's 3,600 years old and is in Mammoth Cave in a little nook and cranny that's seldom visited. Looks like it was just dropped when it failed on the person who was using it. And it's sitting there. And they are still finding new artifacts in Mammoth all the time. Kristen Bobo is she has this amazing nose for finding artifacts. She's a caver and conservationist I write about in the book. And she had some photos on the internet just last week of a couple of new artifacts, including part of a woven sandal that was ancient that she found. In terms of natural minerals, the formations, and there are beautiful formations in caves everywhere, including if you go to a tour cave in Arkansas, you'll see beautiful formations. But Lechuguilla has such a profusion of unique formations. It's probably my favorite. Some of the gypsum formations there, and some of the cave pools that are surrounded by just layers and layers and layers of. You couldn't imagine this as an artwork, and yet there it is. And it's just been sitting in silence and darkness for tens of thousands of years.
She also asked, what's the most interesting or best cave, in your opinion, that you've experienced?
They're all interesting, and they're all really good. I haven't talked much about the pits and the rappelling. Once cavers developed the single rope technique, which they were mostly in northern Alabama, North Georgia, Tennessee, they started looking for deeper pits than they had there. They could get up to over 580 feet at one pit in North Georgia, but they discovered in Mexico, where the limestone is raised higher and there's heavy rainfall, there are pits over 1,000 feet. And so some of those are amazing and gorgeous. One called Golondrinas in Mexico particularly is a very popular destination now. It's almost a tourist destination, but you rappel over 1,000 feet to get to the floor of it.
Now we have Alan, who asked, what's the best example of a caving experience that made you say, wow, I should never have done that? Totally worth it.
There's a whole bunch. I wonder if that's Alan Mosler who asked that, because I do that once or twice a year. And I did one with him while working on the book. There's a cave that we used to go to in South Georgia quite frequently when I was in college. It was where we took novices for beginner trips, and you could climb down to the bottom of the sinkhole easily and climb back up. But that sinkhole was reshaped by a hurricane in the years since I went to college, and we were down there to photograph some bats, and you can't climb that old route anymore, so you have to go down via a cable ladder. Well, I used to do cable ladders pretty often. You've seen them in movies, these wiggly rope-like things that you climb up and down. But normally you would have a belay, which is somebody holding a rope with you, and the cavers that we were with wanted to rig a climb system with one mechanical climber. Long story short, it was an awkward rigging, and it was in the middle of a waterfall, and I got stuck. And I thought, why on earth did I do this? I should have just free climbed it. I should have done something else. And Alan took out his sharp, handy knife and cut me off of the line so I could climb back down and just climb up with a regular belay like I should have done the first time. But, training in caving and having to get yourself out of those bad situations is something that I think makes it a good guide for life. I've been stuck in crawlways. I've gotten confused about the way out of the cave, and I wasn't lost, but like Daniel Boone, I was confused for several hours at one point. But you become a problem solver, and solving those problems, I think that's why so many cavers who don't know what they want to do when they start, they become scientists, because they learn to think outside the box, to figure out puzzles. So long as you survive them, and safety is very important. And what I did, really, if it had been, it was only a 20-foot or so drop. If it had been a 200-foot drop, that would have been a life-threatening situation, and I don't think I would have gotten myself into it as quickly as I did on that trip. It was just a nuisance rather than something bad. But yeah, it is dangerous. And every trip you go on, you have to say, how can I be safe? And sometimes sometimes people get hurt. There's a couple of injuries I write about in the book that you couldn't have foreseen. And then it becomes, how do we rescue this person who's injured out of the cave? One of the guys I write about in the book, Jim Fox, who was injured just last fall, just as I was finishing the books, he not only is healed up, but he's been hiking and climbing and caving all over the place and posting photos of it. But his leg was shattered by a giant rock that fell on him and shoved him down, and just, the nastiest leg break you can imagine. But he had a good rescue, and he's happy to say he's recovered from it now.
Well, we have a few bat lovers in the chat.
Yay. Good for you, bat lovers.
We're going to ask, why are bats important, and what's your favorite type of bat?
I think my favorite type of bat is just the one that I got to know as a bat first when I was caving in Florida, in the caves of South Georgia, just across the Florida line from Tallahassee. Back then we called them pipistrelles, which there's a European bat called the pipistrelle. It turns out they changed the name a few years ago because they're not at all related to pipistrelles. So now they're called tricolor bats, because if you take their fur, it has three colors depending on how far away it gets from the skin. It's golden white. They're very small. They're very social. The mothers will form babysitting groups so that if one mother's out getting food, the other mother babysits for them. And each one, when it flies out at night, will consume, several hundred mosquitoes. And in places like North Florida and South Georgia, that's a great benefit to mankind, is eating all those mosquitoes. I've seen very big bats in the tropics, and those are also interesting. I don't know that they're my favorite, but one time I got to go in a crawlway past multiple colonies of vampire bats in southern Mexico. And, you would know a vampire bat colony was coming in the crawlway where you saw their droppings, and it looked like a scene from a horror movie. But the bats themselves, they were not big and scary like they are in the movie. They're just little bitty things about like that.
Right. What do their droppings look like? Bloody?
Well,
or?
If you can imagine, I hate to do this on the internet, maybe a 3-foot scab that hadn't quite healed over yet. That's what it looked like under those colonies. They mostly were going out and feeding on cattle at night, kind of like a mosquito would, but they were a mammal and not a mosquito.
We do have a few questions about the biology aspect of caving. So we have Lee asking, in your experience at collecting samples for microbes, have you ever come up empty-handed?
Oh yeah, all the time. Going with Diana Northup and another excellent microbiologist, Hazel Barton, who was one of the 2 stars of the Amazing Caves IMAX film a few years ago. I sort of watched them and saw how they could tell these areas where 2 chemicals come together, or 2 different colored minerals come together, or sometimes in water, it's fresh water and salt water coming together if it's near the coast. All of these junction areas offer food for microbes, and so those are the places you want to go sample. And in this pool in Tennessee, we sampled one ring around one of these places where the tar balls erupt. It was kind of like a champagne bottle exploding when they'd erupt. And we got like 6,000 different species, different taxa from this one little spot. But a few feet away, there were these odd floating calcite balls on the surface. And I thought, ooh, that looks good. Let's go take one of those calcite balls in. And nothing at all in the calcite balls. If there had ever been life in them, it was long gone. They may have had fossils in them, like some of the slides I put in Hot Springs years ago. But, it's like any kind of prospecting. Sometimes you come up dry and sometimes you haven't.
I have a few questions from Brianna. She says, I'm a student at HSU studying wildlife biology and recently has been added to the research team with Dr. Eamon.
Welcome, Brianna.
In regards to the microbes found in the Tennessee cave system, are there any hypotheses as to how they are in both the cave system and deep ocean?
Well, there's several hypotheses. I mean, one is that the chemistry dictates the life. So if the chemistry of this cave is very similar to the chemistry of the deep ocean, then it's not surprising that there are similar microbial communities. That leaves open the question of, well, how do they get there in the first place? And I'm probably going to get angry emails from microbiologists that I get this wrong. But there is a sort of emerging theory that there is all this deep life that is down beneath the Earth's crust throughout the Earth and has been for many hundreds of millions of years, long before life came on the surface, perhaps from the moment the Earth cooled enough to support life. And it has been continually churned around as the continents themselves move, as seas lower and rise and hills fold and collapse. And in all of this, it's become spread where when conditions are right, there are some ancient organisms that are able to get a start in those ripe conditions. There's a group that just published in the last couple of weeks that they had revived deep sea organisms from the sediment beneath the seafloor, that the organisms themselves seem to be about 200 million years old. They've just been sitting dormant until the right conditions arrive for them for 200 million years. And it's because of this that these organisms make many scientists think that there's life today, not only beneath Mars, but beneath some of the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, maybe inside some comets, places where there's only occasionally liquid water, but they don't mind waiting it out for millions of years until conditions are right to multiply.
Right. She has a follow-up question. When analyzing DNA, were there any significant differences or possible mutations that would allow similar life in these ecosystems that vary so drastically?
That is probably a question that will make me say something that Dr. Ingman will say, boy, that was a dumb thing to say. I think I'm going to back off of that one. I will say that one of the things I've learned, not only from Dr. Ingman's students at HSU, but from some of these other researchers and going to their labs and watching them work, is that the process of extracting DNA is really complicated, and there's so many ways you can mess it up, that you have to extract it, you have to amplify it, and only then can you begin to test it against the tree of life to see what organisms are related to. Once on a caving trip, I took a daytime excursion in Jamaica to go to the Blue Mountain coffee plantation. That's some of the best coffee on earth. And a guy took me through the process of making Blue Mountain coffee. And there's like 27 steps from the moment you pick that coffee bean until it's ready to put in your grinder. And if you mess up one of those steps, it's a bad batch. It's the same way with preparing DNA. And my hat's off to the scientists who came up with this process. One of the scientists who helped come up with the process that we use for all DNA analysis today, by the way, was a caver, Norm Pace. And I write about him in the book as well.
Okay. We've got time for three. Let's do four more questions.
Good enough.
So be sure to put your comments or questions out there, because at the very end, we're going to randomly select anyone who commented or questioned to win a free copy of the book. Before I ask those questions, you just have a compliment from Bill. He says, the U.S. caving community is proud of you, Mike. Thank you for telling our story so well.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'm always nervous because, like I say, cavers, by and large, don't like to talk about what they're doing, because they don't want people who are unprepared going into a cave and hurting themselves accidentally, or hurting the bats, or hurting the cave formations. And over the years, I've had some cavers come up to me and say, quit writing this stuff, don't share our secrets. But if the public is not educated about it, then the public can't get behind public efforts to conserve caves. And that's why I do it. And I think the caving community, by and large, is really behind that idea. In fact, there's many other good cave writers out there in the caving community, and people who are making films and talking to school groups every weekend and that sort of thing. So it's just what I like to do.
Question from Lee. How far from the entrance were those ancient footprints?
We went there in a roundabout way. So I couldn't tell you exactly in terms of feet, but it was far enough that I was really impressed that people barefoot with cane torches had got there, because they had to walk at least a few hundred feet over some what we call breakdown passage, where you have huge boulders and you're constantly climbing over them, and your footing is not always secure. And there was a lot of stooping and some crawling to get to where they were, unless the cave had changed aspect in the intervening years. And plus, we didn't go there straight from the entrance. We went out straight to the entrance, but we had been mapping new passages in a more distant part of the cave. I would guess they were probably about 800 feet or so from the entrance, but 800 difficult feet. It would have felt like a mile to them when they were underground.
How long does it take to get 800 feet in a cave like that?
If you're a fast caver, not very long at all. If you're doing it for the first time, they probably spent, I would guess, most of a day in there. They may have been camping out at the entrance and going into the cave every day, a little further every day. It was a big passage they went into, but then they went up into a side passage, which was much, more difficult. And one of the reasons cavers wear a helmet with a lamp is the helmet keeps you from bumping your head, and the lamp keeps your hands free so you can climb up things. And there was a lot of climbing and scrambling they would have had to do, but all the while holding their torch and not knocking it out. And when it gets low, pulling another torch out of the little pack they may have had on their back and lighting it with the one that's about to go out. That's serious caving.
Let's see here. We've got another one from Brianna. I was told of an unknown larval salamander in the Tennessee cave system.
Oh, yeah. I forgot all about that. There is an ecosystem in this cave. It's complicated. The cave system has two natural entrances and one artificial entrance. And this passage was a long way where the tarball pool is from any of those entrances, close. But there were salamanders in there, and there are salamanders elsewhere in the cave that are associated with nutrients coming in from the surface. You find salamanders in caves, just like you find them in creeks and rocks all over Arkansas. But in this part of the cave, there were lots of little baby, just hatched salamanders in this pool. And we wondered whether or not they might be, and whatever mama salamanders had laid them, feeding off of the microbial mats that are coming from the deeply rising microbes. There were also insects. You get flying insects near the entrance to the cave. It's unusual deep in the dark zone of a cave to see little midges, or we don't know what they were, flying close to the water and occasionally dead in the water. And so we're partnering with some biologists in Tennessee to go back there as soon as it's safe to travel again and go caving. And we're going to find out more about the salamanders and more about the insects and see if this is a microbial ecosystem that at the base of the ecosystem is these microbes. And we've seen that in many other caves. So it's likely to be happening in this cave. It's just those other caves are out west or in other parts of the world. We've never seen them in an eastern U.S. cave. So that's really exciting.
Mm-hmm. How do you think they're thriving so well in an ecosystem with potential extremophiles?
Well, it's, I've never been in a cave anywhere in the eastern U.S. I've been in one cave in Wyoming where there's native petroleum rising up in the cave, and that cave is full of weird microbes. In fact, that's where some of the first science was done. And so this cave in Tennessee, and it's not the whole cave, it's just one little pool of a cave system that's over 12 miles long, and they're still mapping it in places. But this one little pool, it's got to be the petroleum that's coming up from the depths. I think there's a lot of methane that is coming up with that. There's methanogens, which are bugs that eat methane. We found bugs that eat petroleum. When there's an oil spill, like the one that just occurred in Alaska, one of the things they now do to mitigate is people have created products from these microbes that naturally eat petroleum at great depths in the earth. But if you can make a lot of them, you can help clean up an oil spill with them. And I think that's what's at the basis of this food chain. But these are just guesses. We've only barely begun to do the science in there. What my book has is a teaser of that science, but the real science, which the more complicated it gets, the more as a journalist I have to step back and let the scientists do it. But that's yet to come.
Excellent. Got a couple more questions, and if there's any we didn't get to, maybe Michael here will be kind enough to go through the comments and provide some more information if he gets an opportunity. But
sure.
Let's see. We have Randy asking, are there any, I guess, fictional movies or TV shows that give a realistic depiction of caving?
There's a lot of movies that give a very unrealistic depiction of caving. You're not going to have the bats tangle themselves in your hair. You're not going to run into a race of albino mole people who want to suck your blood. You're not going to have giant spiders to contend with, that sort of thing. There are bits in movies that have done a pretty good job. And now I'm trying to remember, there was a James Cameron movie a few years ago that was loosely based on a true story of a group of cavers trapped by a flood. And it's a father and son, some of the family drama and some of the, one of us has to die, I guess I'll leave you here and the rest of us will get out kind of stuff. That does not happen on caving trips. But until things go south for that group, it was a fairly realistic portrayal of caving. And there's another terrible movie called The Cave, which is about monsters in a cave in Romania released from the deep earth from one of these microbial pits. But the underwater portions were filmed in real caves. Jill Heinerth, who's written an excellent book on cave diving, Depths of the Earth, I think is the name of it. She was in charge of filming the underwater sequences for that movie, and they were highly realistic. Now, there's a lot of good documentaries on caves. In fact, I got a poster in my office from Amazing Caves right there. That's an IMAX film about Hazel Barton, a microbiologist, and Nancy Allenbach, a caver and school teacher, who go looking for unusual life in caves in Mexico and Greenland and the Grand Canyon and all sorts of places. And that's got some amazing photography and a basically accurate picture. Fictional caves, I once had a chance to take a Hollywood director who was working on an early version of a produced movie, take him caving because he wanted to know what real caving was like, and the screenwriter went too. And at one point in the trip, he wanted something with a pit, so we did several days of vertical practice so he could do the pit. He wanted crawlways, he wanted big rooms, he wanted some climbing. We did all that. And at one point, when they had climbed up a 30-foot pit or so in there, the director turned to the screenwriter and said, you know, you could have plenty of action and adventure without monsters. And I said, yes, exactly. That's why cavers do it. But then he wound up not being the director the company used, and the other director put the monsters back in, and that was that. But no monsters, lots of adventure.
The real monster was the journey.
Yeah. There's plenty of those.
Yeah.
There's a caver I write about named Jim Smith in the book, and well, actually, no, it wasn't him. It was another caver who's part of his crew, who sometimes, when it's a really difficult passage, will just, quote Apocalypse Now, which is actually quoting the novel it was based on, and just say the horror. And it's almost a mantra when you're going through those nasty passages.
I won't count this against the last audience question. I thought I'd ask a question of local interest. Here in Hot Springs, of course, we're surrounded by lakes and national park and state parks. Do you have any suggestions of a place that someone maybe curious about caving?
Well, in Arkansas, the geology is just not good for caves south of Interstate 40. You've got to go up to anywhere in the northern third of the state, there are wonderful caves. And Blanchard Springs Caverns is, I think, one of the best tour caves in the country after Mammoth and Carlsbad. And they have a wild caving tour, which unfortunately they're not operating right now because of COVID. But it's like $25 or so, but they give you a helmet and lamp and take you on a true wild cave experience. There are other tour caves in Arkansas that are open now, I saw, and are trying to do social distancing and limited tours, not only lighted walk on a path tours, but wild caving tours. And there's, I think it's cavern.org is the National Show Caves website, and it has a map, and you can click on the state and you can see some of these places in Arkansas, many of which, if you look at them, will take you on a wild tour commercially now, and it'll be safe and guided. There's also organizations you can join. Little Rock is the closest one to us, that are part of the National Speleological Society. If you go to the website caves.org, they have a find a local club. They call them grottos in the NSS. And there are 4 or 5 in Arkansas, most of them up north where the caves are located, which makes sense. But there's a Little Rock Grotto, and all of them will occasionally take beginners on beginner trips if you really want to try it out with a group of actual cavers.
All right, last audience question, and your answer could be funny or tragic or both here, but Raina asked, what is the worst cave you've heard of someone trying to, what's the worst experience you've heard of someone trying to document a cave?
The worst experience of someone trying to document a cave.
Or maybe just even going into a cave. What's
well, I probably shouldn't share the tragic ones. They're very rare, but there have been instances where, especially a big pit that's exposed to the weather, means that mountains crumble to the sea, because when winter comes and freezes the rocks, it presses the cracks, the water expands as it freezes, and the rocks become loose and they fall. And so some of the big pits in Alabama and places like that have loose rocks, and rockfall is a real danger. And there have been a couple of tragic cases where a giant boulder has just fallen, and there's nothing, the person had done absolutely nothing wrong. A giant rock fell on you. Luckily, that's extremely rare. So I hope I never have a giant rock fall on me, and I'm not going to let it stop me from caving. But, there's comical tragedy, which is when people who aren't prepared, who have heard about a cave and say, hey, y'all, let's go in the cave. And there's 7 of them, and they got 4 flashlights between them. and they walk till the flashlights start going out, and suddenly they have one and it goes out, and then they sit down, and they, depending on whether or not anyone knew where they were, they may be sitting down for 3 days before they get rescued. And you know, there's a bumper sticker that says "Cavers Rescue Spelunkers," because that spelunking is sort of a fancy word for caving, and it was invented in the 1930s. And often they say, let's go on a spelunking trip. Those guys who go in with the flashlights. I can't denigrate them. That's how I went the first time. We had no idea what we were doing. It was me and college friends. We had cheap Kmart flashlights. They failed on us. We were wearing tennis shoes, and we slipped and stepped out of our shoes in the mud. We weren't wearing helmets. Luckily, nobody got a concussion. And if we hadn't found the cave club, we wouldn't have known any better. So we could have just as easily been trapped underground for a couple of days if we had let our batteries run down all the way, like some of them.
Okay, well, time to reveal our winners for our 3 signed copies here. I do want to ask everybody if you would let us know what you thought of this presentation. If you have any other suggestions, at gclibrary.com/feedback. We have a new program comment form. So if you want to see more interviews and presentations virtually like this, let us know. So
if anyone has any questions for me, you can reach me through my website, michaelraytaylor.com, and I'd be happy to answer questions from these presentations later on.
Thank you. So first up, we have Bill Steele, Elise Golden, and Jen Hartnett. Bill Steele, Elise Golden, Jen Hartnett, congratulations. We'll have a free copy here for you at the library.
I'm great. Bill Steele is one of the most experienced and honorable cavers I know. So hopefully he'll donate it to a cave club somewhere, since I think he's got his copy already.
If you're not able to come to the library physically to pick it up, you're welcome to send a message to the library's Facebook page, and we'll work something out with you, get you taken care of. Well, I appreciate your time, Michael. This was really fun. A great presentation. I enjoyed talking with you.
I love talking about caves. So it's a pleasure.
I bet before we go, I'll give you the final word. If you remind them where they can find you and your book and any other educational resources about caves.
The book is at Wordsworth. I know they have copies on hand right now. It's not officially published until Saturday, but copies are filtering out, and Wordsworth ordered some in advance. So you can get it there right now in Little Rock, but you can get it anywhere books are sold. And I would appreciate you getting it from an indie bookstore. I also mentioned Speleo Books. If you want lots and lots of books on caving, including all of my earlier books, speleobooks.com is a good place to go get books.
Excellent. And all right, have fun, and you take care, be safe, and good luck in your school year.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. It's been a pleasure. Bye.
Absolutely. Good night.